And I said, I'd like to dedicate this song to the warden. Please release me, let me go, because I don't want to be here anymore. And nobody laughed, not even the warden. They just kept looking at me.
Warning. The political trade features probabilities and perspectives about politicians, political parties, political outcomes, and political wagering. The political trade is rated NSFP, not safe for partisans.
Welcome back to The Political Trade, the podcast for people with a passion for politics, probability, and profits. I'm Jeff Joseph, editorial director of Luckbox magazine, hosting the podcast where conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrats, partisans and wingnuts come together to make money betting on politics by trading in the stock market for politics at predictit.org. Joining us on the show today is former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich. As most of our listeners know, Governor Blagojevich was convicted of crimes, including trying to sell the U.S. Senate seat that belonged to Barack Obama, and was sentenced to prison. 5 of the 18 counts, those related to his efforts to secure a cabinet seat in exchange for the Senate seat, were later overturned by an appeals court. But to the surprise of many legal observers, his sentence remained the same. On February 18th of this year, President Trump announced Blagojevich's commutation. Now he's hosting the Lightning Rod podcast weekly with Mark Vargas, who joined us on this podcast last week. And today, the governor will be joining us for 2 special episodes. In part 1, we'll talk to Governor Blagojevich about his past 8 years, the DNC, the RNC, what's ahead for him in the future, criminal justice reform, and a host of other topics. In part 2, we'll walk the governor into the predicted trading pits to get his take on some of the most popular and profitable political prediction markets. I'm joined, as always, by Mike Reddy. Mike's an editor at Luckbox magazine, a new prediction market trader, and the producer of The Political Trade. Mike, did you watch the first evening of the RNC convention last evening?
Well, Jeff, I saw bits and pieces of it, and I don't want to go on too much of a tangent here, but something really stood out to me, and it certainly sparked some buzz on social media. Did you happen to catch it was in Trump's opening speech, the 12 more years comment?
I actually did not see that part, but I read a little bit about it today on social media and in some of the stories.
Essentially, what happened was they were chanting 4 more years, and Trump made a comment along the lines of, if you really want to make him angry, say 12 more years, right? And so they started chanting 12 more years, and it was trending on Twitter. It sparked a lot of press. Vox News ran the headline, 12 more years. Trump's opening speech got the 2020 RNC off to a dark start. Vanity Fair published, Say 12 More Years at the RNC, Trump's authoritarian joke slips closer to reality. At any case, here's the clip.
4 more years! 4 more years! Now, if you want to really drive him crazy, you say 12 more years.
That's what I saw.
Well, I guess the media proves once again it literally cannot take a joke. We bring up the convention because we certainly want to get the governor's take on the DNC convention, the Republican convention night 1 last night. But I'll give you some quick observations on it, having watched the first night of the Republican convention. On the style alone, on production, what stood out in sharp contrast to me was the optical difference. The Democratic convention relied heavily on Zoom and Zoom-like feeds. In sharp contrast, last night we saw the first night of the Republican convention, and they made what I think was a more prudent decision to use a live venue and to allow their speakers to have a much longer speaking period, which allowed for more definitive messaging and the opportunity to really get a long thought out. And I think it set the stage for providing just a better experience for the viewers. So that was my takeaway. Is substantively, everyone's going to debate that because that's what we all do nowadays. But when it came to the actual style and the production values, I think the Republicans had a clear winner in their convention format in the manner in which it was produced. So I look forward to the governor's take on the substance of the convention, and what we should really be doing is bringing our guest on. So, Governor Blagojevich, are you on the line with us?
Yes, I am. Thank you for having me, Jeff, and hello, Michael.
Well, it is our distinct pleasure to have you join us, and I have to tell you something. And when we chatted briefly yesterday, I did mention that I had met you before, but I did not tell you the circumstances of that. So I'm going to share that with you briefly right now. You and I shared an elevator ride, just the two of us, about 15 years ago, which would put you somewhere in your first term. This was at the Drake Hotel in Chicago. You and I were both in black tie. We were heading up to the top floor. Apparently, we were attending different events because we went our separate ways when we hit the top and did not meet again. But during that short ride to the top, you connected with me and made a lasting impression. Um, of course, I immediately recognized you and nodded. You began the conversation. You looked directly in my eyes and asked me if I was a Syrian. No one's ever asked me that prior, and no one's ever asked me that since. I am, in fact, of Assyrian descent. Assyrians are an ancient civilization that once had an empire in the Mesopotamia. But globally, there's maybe 3.5 million Assyrians, and in the US, certainly under 400,000. When I answered that I was indeed Assyrian, you began telling me about the accomplishments of my ancestors. And what struck me beyond the improbability that anyone would peg me as Assyrian, let alone know our history, was the manner in which you connected. You were the governor at the time, and it became very clear to me in that short elevator ride how exactly that came to be. And I shared that episode with many people in the years to follow, just a very brief meeting with you, and how talented I thought you were as a communicator and how you engage. And I clearly see that as being one of the elements that was behind your popular and populist support that you enjoyed your first two terms as governor.
Thanks for saying that, Jeff. You know, your heritage and your ancestry is remarkable. I mean, we owe libraries to the Assyrians. You were the ones who established the first libraries. Imagine where we'd be as a world if there weren't libraries and there weren't things like books and learning and all the rest. And it all started there with your ancestors. So I appreciate you recalling that story. I'm sorry I don't remember it exactly, but
Nor do I
I know a
expect you
lot about the
to.
Assyrians.
I would well. I would also answer. There you go. There you go again. There was I was just so impressed by, first of all, your ability to pull that out of the air. But we'll move on. In the last episode of the Political Trade podcast, Mark Vargas, the man who worked diligently behind the scenes with your wife Patty to secure your commutation, joined us as a guest, as you know. And that podcast resulted in more comments from listeners than any prior podcast. And I invite listeners to just listen into that last podcast as well. You remain a lightning rod today, which is also the name of your podcast that you share with Mark Vargas. And there's a lot of interest in you, Governor. With Mark, we spent considerable time relitigating your prosecution. And there is so much that I'm hoping to chat about with you today. I hope to spend time actually on other topics. But I would like to clarify something. Essentially, you were charged and convicted with attempting to sell the Illinois Senate seat that was vacated when Illinois Senator Barack Obama assumed the presidency. Of course, those charges were later overturned, but your 14-year sentence wasn't. Uh, Other than the tape that we played on the last podcast, where you referred to the Senate seat as golden and that you weren't just going to give it away, was there ever any evidence of you naming a price for that seat?
Well, no, of course not. But and by the way, it was not just golden. I said effing golden, and I'm
Fucking
still eating
golden,
those
yes.
words. Yeah, I'm
That's
still
right,
eating those
yes.
words. You know, the other day I was reading a history book, and it talked about it was about Abraham Lincoln, and it was about the Gettysburg Address, and I couldn't help but think how some of our great leaders in American history are remembered for the beautiful words that they've spoken. Abraham Lincoln, of the people, by the people, and for the people, right? With malice toward none, with charity for all. Franklin Roosevelt, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. President Kennedy, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. President Reagan, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Obama, change and hope, hope and change. And me, this is fucking golden. I'm not giving it up for nothing. Um, so what my point is, I sure better do something with my life, because if I were to die today, that's my obituary. And it's really galling, because I was saying that half in jest, that the rest of the conversation was not played in court, was not played for the public. If they had anything that would have suggested something like a price tag that you referred to, that would have been all over the place, and rightfully so. But the fact that there was the absence of that indicates that this was just talk about routine political stuff. In fact, the thing that came after that conversation, again, the tapes were minimized, they were cut off, and they were under seal by the court. They wouldn't allow me to publicly talk about them, reveal them, or even introduce them in court. So what I said after that was, too bad my nephew wasn't turning 30 instead of 29. I can give him a Senate seat for his birthday. It was just talk, not unlike what President Trump just did when he talked about 12 more years. But this is what some of these people do. And of course, the media, being as dishonest as they are, they run with twisted things because they make big headlines, because they're no longer a profession that chases the truth first. Instead, they chase advertising dollars and narratives that they think can sell viewership. And so these are some of the challenges we have in our democracy today, Jeff, that I joke about it, and I'm speaking kind of lightly about it, but frankly, these are very serious issues, and they go to the future of our ability as people in a free society to choose for ourselves our own leaders, the right of the people to self-government, and to be able to get information that's honest and informative, not just propaganda.
Was any evidence ever put forth that you were offered anything by anyone for the seat?
Yes, there was. There was a conversation that my brother had with me on the I want to say it was perhaps the 31st of October, 2008, a day or so after I learned later that they were taping my calls. And my brother had indicated that a supporter of mine and supporter of other Democrats from the Indo-American community had suggested that a certain congressman had offered $1.5 million in campaign contributions in exchange for me making him a senator. Now, campaign contributions under the law and just taking cash for yourself is treated differently. Cash is obviously a lot more blatant and more illegal. You don't have to prove a quid pro quo in that. You can infer a quid pro quo. Right. But when it comes to campaign contributions, the Supreme Court has said for that to be a crime, you must show the element of an express quid pro quo. That offer was that. It was an express quid pro quo. I quickly told my brother to stay away from it, not to do anything with it, to turn it down, and of course he did. Now, what's interesting is that they played a portion of that tape at trial, that the illegal offer. They did not play the rest of the conversation where I told my brother to stay away from it. In fact, they minimized that conversation. And for your listeners who may not know what minimization is, it's the FBI turning the tape recorder off, or perhaps they may have erased it. Whatever it was, they didn't like the answer. And they're not supposed to minimize things that go to the very heart of the criminal allegations that they're making. They're supposed to minimize personal things like whether or not you're making love to your wife or something. That sort of stuff they're supposed to minimize, but they're absolutely supposed to tape the conversations relative to what they're alleging is the criminal behavior. In this case, they turned it off. And when I tried to explain to the jury that they did that the transcript had these stars underneath where it was blocked out, the judge was all over me, threatening to hold me in contempt of court if I talked about things that were not in the transcripts. But this was another example of how corrupt the prosecution was. And one of the big lessons that I learned, and I would share this with your listeners across America, don't trust completely the integrity of the criminal justice system or the federal courts, because they're just people too. And they're capable of being corrupted just like everybody else. And power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that system is a corrupt one that's broken. It's also racist. I'm sure we'll talk about that later.
Good. And we'll, as a final question, was any evidence ever offered that you received any form of consideration for the seat?
No, because there wasn't any. I never did. And none of these things were so-called completed acts. These were all allegedly attempts. In fact, they arrested me at 6 o'clock in the morning on the 9th of December, 2008, with SWAT teams around my house, the sitting governor. Nothing was done. and they listened to the tapes and they saw I was about to make a political deal that was going to benefit the people of Illinois. They didn't want that to happen, so they came out and arrested me. And then the U.S. attorney, this corrupt Patrick Fitzgerald, goes out and lies to the people. And by the way, here's another lesson. These people used a playbook that Adolf Hitler bragged about. He writes about this in Mein Kampf. It's called The Big Lie. You go out there and start out the conversation by telling the big lie. And so they went out and accused me of trying to sell Obama's Senate seat, which later on, as you pointed out, was reversed by the appellate court. And they called it routine political log rolling. But he called this the sale of the Senate seat. That's what he called it. So he set forth this big lie. And Winston Churchill, Hitler's nemesis, used to say a lie could travel halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to put its pants on. And ever since then, I've been trying to pull my pants up because this big lie still sticks to me, and it's making me effing pissed off. Sorry.
That's fair. Well, in July of 13, you filed an appeal with the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit in Chicago. It challenged the conviction and the length of the prison term. The court unanimously vacated 5 of the corruption convictions, including the conviction of attempting to sell the vacant U.S. Senate seat of Obama. But oddly, it affirmed the rest. And in resentencing, which occurred then, August 2016, a resentencing hearing, Judge Zagel reimposed the same 14-year sentence he had imposed in 2011, even though the most salacious charges of trying to sell the Senate seat were reversed. How do you explain that?
Well, again, for your listeners, none of the allegations, and it's certainly true, allege I took anything for myself. I never took any gifts. I didn't take free vacations. I didn't take cash. Nobody in my family benefited financially from anything in my administration. In fact, I issued an executive order by myself to prevent any of my family members of doing business with the state of Illinois. Very different from how it operates in Illinois today with Mike Madigan and the Democratic Party and all the intervening corruption and how these guys are lobbyists and legislators. But that's another conversation for a different podcast. I did just the opposite.
Well, actually, it's a conversation for your podcast. You cover extensively on Lightning Rod with Mark Vargas as well, corruption issues in the state of Illinois, and you speak to Governor Pritzker and Mike Madigan and Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot, issues currently governing the state as well. So I suggest our listeners should tune in if you want to learn more about Illinois politics. But coming back to your case, and Mark and I discussed this in the prior podcast, what really stood out here, and I think what compelled so many people to be an advocate for your release across party lines, was the sentencing itself. Judge Zagel, who sentenced you to 14 years and didn't, upon the reversing of those convictions, did not readjust your sentence. What would you attribute that to?
They wanted to bury me because I was out there telling the truth, and they were afraid of the truth. The governor from the 5th largest state in America was stolen from the people who elected him by a corrupt prosecutor and prosecutors. It was a corrupt prosecution. What they upheld as the appellate court were 3 fundraising requests. But what they did was they allowed the government to move the line and change the law, and they upheld what is not the law. I believe they did it because the scandal the other way would be so big that if they had shown that they had thrown me in prison and had me impeached and removed for things that weren't crimes across the board, I believe they upheld that to protect the prosecutors, to protect the government, and frankly, to protect the judge. Because the fact is very clear. The law was stated in the United States Supreme Court, McCormick versus the United States, that the request for a campaign contribution is a First Amendment right. That was reaffirmed in the Citizens United case that came out while I was sitting in prison in 2014. Asking for a campaign contribution or having the ability to give a campaign contribution is free speech. The only compelling state interest to limit that free speech was what the court called quid pro quo corruption. They defined quid pro quo corruption as having evidence of an express quid pro quo in the nature of an agreement, where the public official, the governor in my case, says, hey, Joe Blow, if you give $10,000 to my campaign, I'll give you contracts. That would be a crime. That's an express quid pro quo. Or if a member of Congress says to an intermediary of the governor, I'll do $1.5 million in campaign contributions in exchange for the governor making me a U.S. senator. If that happened, that would be criminal. Those would be express quid pro quos. However, It is routine politics, and it happens every day in every place in government, in the U.S. Senate, in the U.S. Congress, the presidents of our country, governors across America, mayors across America, candidates for every office. That if you have business before you, let's say the pharmaceutical industry has a bill before a United States senator, and the pharmaceutical industry wants that senator to vote for that bill, and that senator votes for that bill. That senator still can seek a campaign contribution so long as he's not making a promise or a deal. You understand? The fact that we asked for campaign contributions, which I wasn't the one asking, it was through a third party. My brother, who had worked for me in the campaign, was the person making the requests. Can you do a fundraiser for us from a hospital that I had committed $8 million to? The request was, can you do a fundraiser for us? He never brought up the public official act that I did, the $8 million. He simply said, you've raised money for us before. Can you do it again? The guy said, I don't know. I'll get back to you. The prosecutor before the jury says that was the shakedown. But that's not a shakedown unless there's a quid pro quo. That was an ask. So they convicted me on an unlawful standard that says that any elected official who seeks a campaign contribution from anybody who does business in government or before them in one capacity or another, and you can have a third party say that they were connected somehow, that the request was because the politician knew he did something for them, that's a crime. If that's a crime, and that's what I stayed in prison on and went to prison for, if that's a crime, then every U.S. senator, every congressman, every governor, every mayor should have gone to prison with me. It's not a crime. It was upheld. And again, I truly believe because they were protecting and covering up the corrupt stealing of a governor from the people. They didn't have the crimes. They had extended themselves by making an arrest of a governor. They had to bury me because it was either they were going to be in big trouble or I would go free, or they kept me buried for as long as they did. What they weren't counting on was the fact that some of the very same people, Comey, Fitzgerald, and some of those same people using the same playbook who were successful at the AAA level to do to a Democratic governor what they did to me, tried to do it at the major league level to a Republican president. And look at the parallels. Russian collusion. It's a clever word. It's a phrase that Madison Avenue might come up with. But it was all baloney. There was no evidence of any kind of collusion. But they come up with these big names and they tell that big lie, and then you're stuck with it. You spend all your time trying to say it's not so. And so some of the very same people tried to do it to President Trump, an attempted coup d'etat. And I truly believe, frankly, that because of their actions, that and other reasons, I think I came to the attention of President Trump. And that explains, I think, in part at least, why I'm here today doing this podcast with you.
Well, the sentencing alone was quite excessive, and that seems to be a consensus. And as we mentioned in the podcast with Mark, Judge Zagel, who sentenced mob hitman Nicholas Calabrese, the admitted killer of 14 people, to just 12 years and 4 months behind bars. So an admitted murderer of 14 people received 12 years. You received a 14-year sentence.
I did, Jeff, and there's a lesson here which is frightening and terrifying to the American people. We're supposed to be a country of laws, not men. We're supposed to be governed by the rule of law. This is supposed to be a constitutional government. And we all, especially those in high official positions like governors, presidents, senators, congressmen, and absolutely judges, as well as prosecutors, need to be particularly mindful of that. And yet what you have now is a system in that federal court system anyway. I'm not speaking to the state system, but at the federal level, if you have the temerity to fight for your innocence, if you truly believe that you're innocent, if you're the governor as I was, and you believe, as I did, that I had a public duty to fight back, had I did it, I had a responsibility to accept the responsibility and admit it and take my medicine. But I didn't. They were the ones bringing the crimes. They were the ones with fake crimes trying to steal a governor. I felt obligated to fight back, and I did. And I was very vocal about it. I was very public about it. I did a whole bunch of television shows and all the rest. People thought I was crazy. My lawyers, some of them were urging me not to do it, and because this is not how it's done in the federal court, that it's disrespectful to the court somehow. And yet I asked myself, this is supposed to be America, the land of the free, and we have constitutional rights to a trial by jury and to exercise our right to free speech and to go out there and defend yourself. And an innocent man, I believe, fights to defend himself. And then when you're the governor on top of that, It isn't just about your own innocence. You have an obligation to the people who elected you. You swore an oath of office on the Holy Bible to protect the Constitution and the rule of law. I had a responsibility to fight back because they were stealing me from the people with these lies. And so I did. And that would explain partly why I got the sentence that I got, because I fought back as I did. And I would point this out, Jeff. They didn't convict me on these things at the first trial. So after they were unable to convict at the first trial, they tried me a second time. That's when they moved the lines and changed the law by themselves. And I was convicted on fake law. And that's not a first either, because federal prosecutors did this to Arthur Anderson. That case that cost thousands of people their jobs. The Supreme Court took that case and ruled 9-0 that the prosecutor Andrew Weissman and his team had wrongfully convicted Arthur Anderson for things that weren't crimes. So this isn't a first that they did to me. They've done it before, and they have a tendency to use the playbooks that work for them. They're less interested in doing justice. In fact, in too many cases, they're more interested in committing injustice if it promotes their partisan political agenda or their own careers.
Well, to get to that, on March 15th of 2012 is when you reported to Inglewood Federal Correctional Institute in Colorado, and that was to begin serving a 14-year sentence. So you ended up spending 8 years there. How did you spend your time? And what should people know about federal prison?
Well, first, that it sucks and you never want to go there. Second, my experience was two-tiered. The first 32 months was in a higher security prison. I'm pretty certain I'm the only governor in American history to have spent 1 minute in prison for just fundraising issues alone. And second, I'm the only governor in American history to have ever been in a higher security prison. Because if you have a sentence of more than 10 years, they have to put you into a higher security prison. You can't be in what's called the prison camps. And so the first 32 months I was in that prison, it was prison. It was a real prison. There were 900 inmates there or thereabouts, give or take an inmate or two, drug dealers and gangbangers, drug cartel kingpins. There were bank robbers. There were men that were committed murder, con artists, a whole bunch of sex offenders. There was only about 2% were the so-called white-collar criminals. And, my home was originally in a big, like a dormitory place with bunk beds where there were like 90 other guys. And then if you behave well and do well, you can work your way into the high rent district, which is you get your own cell with another inmate, which is 6 by 8 feet with a bunk bed. I slept on the top bunk. I ultimately got there after the first year. And, they shut you in at night. They lock you in. They limit and restrict your movements. You wear prison clothes, and it's stark, cold, and harsh. And there was no air conditioning. And that first summer, I think they set a record for the hottest days in Denver history. We had several days over 100 degrees, and without the air conditioning, and you got 90 to 100 men in one place in our unit. No air conditioning. They had these big like fans they would bring in. But if you were to ask me when most of the fights started, it was in the heat of the summer on nights where it was unbearable and you couldn't sleep, and the guys would fight over fans, and the fights were serious. Whenever you'd see a guy putting his boots on in the nighttime and putting a lock in his sock, the rumbling was going to start. So it was a very, very different place than the camp that I eventually went to, and after 32 months. But one thing about prison is it gives you a chance to catch up on your reading. And I spent a lot of my time reading, and I read a lot of books. And I had the good fortune of being able to read the Bible in a way that I never read before in my life. I mean, I believe in God, always have. I believed in prayer, always have. I was baptized in the Eastern Orthodox, Serbian Orthodox Church as a child, and it's always been part of who I am. I wish I'd have gone to church more often. I can't claim that I didn't. But then when I was there in prison and, taken off that high mountain and buried in a deep, dark valley in that prison, with all those guys and all alone and yearning for my family, missing my daughters, worrying about them, not able to provide for them or protect them, my wife all by herself, raising our kids as a single mother, and of course all the publicity that went along with what happened. It was very comforting to me to reacquaint myself with God and do it through His Word. And so I was really fortunate in the sense that I spent a lot of time reading the Bible, but not rushing, reading it carefully and slowly and rereading it and thinking about it. And that really helped me through the 8 years. And I feel in so many ways that, some of that really harsh experience has served a much better purpose. And I truly feel like I understand God better. And I'm not claiming to be, a holy roller or someone who's born again or anything like that. I've always believed in God, but I feel I have a better understanding, and I'm stronger in my faith as a result of it, my Christian faith. And I feel that's a blessing. And when everything slows down as it did, to be able to read the Bible that way was very helpful. And of course, I read a lot of history books, read literature, um, and so I did a lot of reading. And then I exercised a lot. And I don't know that I could have gotten through those 8 years with any kind of form of cheerfulness if I didn't have the outlet of physical activity. And one of the good things about the prison I was at, the higher security one, as well as the camp, the facilities for working out were very good. And I ran a lot, was in the weight room a lot. I consider myself still very, fit as a fiddle. Unlike our current governor, Pritzker, I think I could kick his ass in any physical activity, not even close. In fact, I'm the only governor in Illinois history who ever ran the river to river race, which is an 82-mile race from the Mississippi River all the way across southern Illinois to the Wabash River on the Indiana side. You do it with relay teams, and everybody runs about 11 miles. But I'm the only governor who ever did that, and I guarantee you, if we're going to do that betting thing we're going to do later, I'll I'll put $1 on whether Governor Pritzker will ever do that. So,
Well, who were your friends in prison? How'd you make friends, and who'd you spend your time with?
well, I made a lot of friends in prison, and I consider these guys, friends still. I'm not able to talk to them now because of I'm still on probation, and so I have to wait for this probationary period before I can talk to any of my former colleagues because there are certain rules and restrictions. But no, I made some. Of course, you make friends in where you are, and I met a lot of, you know, guys that I really think highly of. Look, um, most of them were guilty of the crimes they were in prison for. The drug dealers, they were in that business, and they have real ability as salespeople and being able to distribute product. The problem was they were doing something that's on the wrong side of the line, and they correctly, have to pay their debt to society. And we'll talk more about criminal justice reform. But what's really terrible is the length of the sentences these first-time nonviolent drug dealers are getting. So some of my friends, a lot of my friends were guys who did that, who were in that business. They were guys that I knew from the neighborhood I grew up in. They were very similar. They didn't get a chance to get the schooling they could have gotten for a variety of reasons because of their backgrounds. But yes, I made friends with many of them, and I made friends with other guys that some guys that were white collar. One guy was a real estate developer from Beverly Hills who got caught up in a $100 million fraud on banking. Lehman Brothers, I guess, became very friendly with him, and my wife talks to his son sometimes still. I became very friendly with a guy who was also a musician who had actually performed with the Doobie Brothers as their fourth like guitarist when one of the Doobie Brothers was unable to perform. This guy would be brought on when they were in tour, and he was in prison because he had made a big mistake. He was in a divorce with his wife, and he decided to make a quick $10,000 by smuggling drugs in from Mexico, and he got caught at the border. So he was given like a 5-year sentence. But he was the guy that, with me, we put together our prison rock band that we called G-Rod and the Jailhouse Rockers, which maybe you'll ask me about, maybe you won't. But
Well, let's talk about it. It's definitely
okay.
on the list. I know you're well known as being an Elvis fan, so that was your Elvis outlet, I would imagine.
Well, it was less the Elvis outlet, though I did Elvis. But here's what I discovered. In the very early stages, those first few years, particularly at that harder prison, but it wasn't so much the circumstances where I was. Um, it was the fact that I'd just been home and now I was away, and I had to face 14 years, and that's a long time away. And you can't even see the flicker of a light at the end of the tunnel when you're facing something like that. And you've got to, your heart's broken, and you're hurting, and you yearn for your family. You miss your children. You miss your wife. You worry about them, as I said. You can't protect them or provide for them. You're helpless. You've been taken out of the world, and you're compelled to be there. And you hope that the system will be fair and treat you right. And you're going to win on your appeal. I would learn many hard lessons later on that that's not true. You can't trust that. But in the beginning, there was a hole inside of me that was always with me. It was a constant companion, a loneliness. I would say loneliness was my constant companion, and yearning for home. And there was deep sadness. Now, I found it was really important to try to stay upbeat, and that was really important that every day you set goals for yourself because you just got to keep going. Teddy Roosevelt said that black hair never catches a rider whose pace is fast enough. And so I was determined, irrespective of what I thought was good for me, I just had to be strong for my children and my wife. I had to ease their difficulties and their burdens because they were hurting too, and I had left them behind. So I had to be strong for no other reason for them. And to be strong and to stay strong, I had to be busy and work on things and have goals and do them short term every day, set goals that I had to achieve. So that kept me focused on things and took me out of the place I was in. And I met this guy, as I talked about, the musician, and he started teaching me how to play the guitar. And so I got there on the 12th of March 2012, which was a Thursday. And then by, I would say, June of 2012, he started tutoring me on playing the guitar. And I began to learn the guitar, and it was something to work on. And I would spend hours at it. And I was starting to get, competent enough to actually play a few tunes, right? And then my job was, at first I spent 3 months in the kitchen working in the warehouse because you're required to go to the kitchen. And then after 3 months, you can try to get your own job. And I became a tutor. So I taught history. I taught Civil War history, American Civil War, and I taught World War II history to my fellow inmates. That's a whole different story, some of those stories. So one day we decided to perform for the Civil War class a combination of the Battle Hymn of the Republic and Dixie on the guitars, which we did. But I was flubbing it a little bit because I had my class there, and these guys were kind of taking my attention off of it. And so to take the attention off of the flubbing, I started to sing the Green, Green Grass of Home, which is an old country song about a guy in prison, right, who wakes up from a dream when he imagined himself back home with his beloved Mary and his mother and father meeting him at the train station. But it turned out,
Hair of golden, lips like cherries, right?
there you go, Jeff. That's right. He wakes up with 4 cement walls that surrounded him, right? And he realized the Padre was there, that old Padre, and he's going to be hanged. And so I started singing that, and then the whole class started singing because they, when you're a prisoner and you're an inmate, I learned this. Fellow inmates know all the prison songs. You can imagine Johnny Cash is really popular in prison, right? So I started singing that, and then this guy said, well, why don't we put together a band and maybe you do a little singing? And so that was the genesis of the band that later became known as G-Rod and the Jailhouse Rockers. And then we worked real hard, several hours a day, to audition, and then ultimately we were successful to perform for the GED graduation, which took place in June of 2013, a little after, more than a year after I'd been in prison. And we did 6 songs, and we did Better Man by not Garth Brooks, but Clint Black. He was on Celebrity Apprentice. And we did an Elvis medley, which was all of Don't Be Cruel, 2 verses of That's All Right Mama, 2 verses of All Shook Up, and of course, all 4 verses of, or 5 verses of Jailhouse Rock. And it took about 8 minutes and 23 seconds. I sang it, and I never knew that the drummer boy from Illinois went crash, boom, bang, right? Or that, some of the other language in that song until I actually got down and learned it and practiced it a lot. And so it was really good. You know why? And here's what I'd like to leave you with. Music, I found in the early years of prison for me, was a way to take me out of prison, if for only a few hours a day. And we worked really hard to try to do well at that concert. And the work was therapeutic because it focused me on something that took me away from my troubles and kept me from dwelling on my misfortune and the unhappy state I was in. And I credit that to shortening my sentence, if you know what I'm talking about. And I think the guys at the GED graduation, if I could just leave you with this, it was surreal because there's 110, 120 guys dressed in gowns. And every day I see them on the prison yard, and they're tough guys, all tatted up, a lot of these guys, big muscles, okay, shaved heads. They got all kinds of tattoos that say all kinds of things. Some of them, frankly, white supremacists. Some of the black guys, rough and tumble guys. The Latino guys, rough and tumble. I mean, there were a lot of rough and tumble guys. And there they were, getting their GED because they were required to do it. And I'm on the stage, and I'm looking at the audience, and I'm seeing these guys who only the day before had their shirts off with their big muscles brimming and their tattoos shining, and they're wearing gowns and caps. And it was laughable because it didn't fit. And the warden was there, and all the brass were there. And right before we started our program, I decided to ad-lib a song, Jeff. I changed the words of the song, "Please Release Me." You familiar with that song, Jeff and Mike?
Sure,
Right?
of course.
And I said, I'd like to dedicate this song to the warden. Please release me, let me go, because I don't want to be here anymore. And nobody laughed, not even the warden. They just kept looking at me. So that was the last time I had lived. We just went with the program, and I think we did all right.
So music helped you deal with perhaps the depression and that loneliness that you speak to. But were you bitter during this period?
Yes, in the beginning, filled with a lot of anger and bitterness. Yes, but here the Bible helped me, and reading Scripture, and of course, my Christian faith, and you're required to be forgiving. I tend to be more Old Testament when I think about those guys that did this to me, those people who did it to me. I tend to find myself reading the Old Testament when I have to ask myself whether I can be forgiving or not, because my Christian faith requires it. And I have to confess I haven't quite gotten to that point. However, um, it helped me a tremendous amount in pushing away the anger and the bitterness and leaving it aside, and just sort of accepting that sometimes in life things happen, and they're the mysteries of God. We don't know why they've happened. Dr. Martin Luther King said the object of life really is not, as the Declaration of Independence promises, the pursuit of happiness. It is instead to do God's will. And in my mind and in my heart, I truly believe, after I was able to read the Bible through the years in prison, that there's a purpose for everything, including what happened to me and to my family. And so from that point of view, it was very helpful to me to get away from the anger and the bitterness. And so I would say, well into half my sentence, if not before that, I was well past the anger, and pretty much accepting, my fate, and then recognizing the importance of trying to deal with my fate in as manful a way as I possibly could. So I'm well past the bitterness and the anger. I am not at the point of forgiveness, not the prosecutors who criminally put me in prison and destroyed, in many ways the life that we lived and hurt my family as they did. I don't hate them, but I haven't yet gotten to the point of forgiveness. I will try to keep working at that as I pursue justice, which I'm determined to do until I take my last breath.
When did you become aware of the growing effort that was advocating on behalf of your commutation?
Well, it's really remarkable. Here again, I see the hand of God in it, and um, because we were at the last point where we had exhausted all of our options. We thought we really had a real good chance to get into the Supreme Court, that they would have to take the case because of the issue of where the line on fundraising is, and that if they uphold my standard, then every senator and every congressman, every governor, and everybody in politics who seeks a campaign contribution from anybody who has business with government will face prison. That the Supreme Court had to clarify that decision by the Seventh Circuit in my case was very much in conflict with let's say Senator Menendez's jurisdiction, where the Supreme Court said there was insufficient evidence. There was no quid pro quo in his case, or Governor McDonnell in his case, a 9-0 ruling by the Supreme Court, no quid pro quo. Why would I not be treated the same way? And so we thought the Supreme Court would take it, and they didn't. And here we were, having exhausted all of our remedies. President Obama had chosen not to commute my sentence.
Let's talk about that for a moment.
Okay.
You were pretty close with Obama confidant David Axelrod and Obama's Attorney General Eric Holder, but as you just said, Obama refused to take up your case. Why was that? What do you attribute that to?
Well, politics. I attribute it to politics. His politics. He made a decision to not do it. I can only speculate on why he chose not to. I thought, frankly, that in the days leading up to the end of his administration, that he was going to do it. I had reason to believe that. David Axelrod, as you say, was Barack Obama's media consultant. He was also mine when I ran for Congress. And David was an advocate for us, and talked to Patty, my wife, and was able to deliver personally letters from my two daughters to President Obama. My daughters are the same age as his two young, beautiful daughters. And so I thought that was going to be very helpful. I was in a unique position and very lucky that way, because most of my fellow inmates, none of them had that kind of access to a president. They were trying to get commutations themselves, but they had to go through the usual channels. I was able to get my cause right before the actual president. In my case, it turned out to be two of them. But Axelrod brought the letters to President Obama. And then Obama decided the days before he left, and before a decision was reached on me, to commute the sentences of a FALN terrorist who was, convicted of wanting to bomb federal buildings. It may have bombed federal buildings. I don't know the details exactly. And then a guy that was convicted of treason, a guy named Bradley Manning, who was given a 35-year sentence, who then, after 7 years or so, went through a gender change and he became Chelsea Manning. And President Obama then released him, or her, I should say, forgive me, her. And I thought, well, I think my chances are really good if he's sticking his neck out to do that. But then he didn't. And by the way, we understood his politics. So I didn't ask that he commute my sentence on the day that he leaves office. I recognized it was a sensitive political thing for him, so that when he leaves the White House and the media covers him leaving the White House, they'd cover me at the same time leaving the shit house. I thought that would not be good optics for him. So we instead said, why don't you just cut my sentence in half? Instead of 14 years, make it 7. It's still higher than any other governor's ever gotten. And I'll limp home in October of 2017 after you march home from the White House in January of 2017. So I'd go home 6 months later, or 7 months later. Well, 9 months later. But he didn't do it, and it was, disappointing. But then there you have the hand of God. Mark Vargas comes into our lives. I never knew him. I never knew who he was. And after the Supreme Court years later would turn us down, and we had exhausted all of our remedies, last line of defense as far as I was concerned, then Mark Vargas came out of nowhere. I say he's an angel sent to us from heaven. I truly believe it. And here's this kid from Naperville, the son of a truck driver and a working mom, and a young guy, and he's telling Patty, I'm going to get your husband home. And I'm telling her over the phone, because they limit your telephone calls. You only have 300 minutes a month. So I would ration my calls 10 minutes a night. I was very disciplined about that, so I could talk to my kids and my wife every night and no one else. And she would tell me about this guy Vargas. And, I was filled with a lot of skepticism, but desperate to be hopeful. And within a couple of days, it didn't take long for Mark to prove his bona fides. Suddenly, my case is on Fox News, and Mark and I indirectly through email collaborated on doing an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal, which they published. And here I am sitting in prison, writing an op-ed that gets published in the Wall Street Journal, warning all my fellow politicians to stop raising money because it'll land you in prison. You can't do campaign contributions anymore. And then, of course, it took 2 years of ups and downs, but Mark was an expert at handling it. I call him the mystery man because I'd never met him, didn't know who he was. And I said when I came home the day after that if you're looking for a guy who can get you out of prison if you find yourself stuck there, Mark Vargas is the guy that you want.
Well, on August 8th of 2019, the president tweeted that many people have asked that I study the possibility of commuting your sentence and that it was a very severe one. White House staff is continuing to review this matter. Was that a turning point for you where you began to feel pretty hopeful of an outcome?
Well, it began before that, actually. It began shortly after Mark came into our lives. In fact, it was in the summer of 2018. I think it was, I want to say May. It was after the Wall Street Journal put that article, that op-ed in. 2 days after that, President Trump had publicly stated that he was thinking about pardoning Martha Stewart and commuting my sentence. And that was explosive news in my prison, as you can imagine, because it was all over the news.
Sure, that was June of 2018.
Right, there you go, June of 2018. And of course, it was a big deal for me and for my wife and my daughters. And it was extremely hopeful. Why would he say that if he wasn't really thinking of doing it? And so, we were hopeful. But again, I know the business and I know politics. I do think I know that. I mean, I remember asking Patty, if I ever do come home, honey, what would I do for a living? I mean, I really don't have any skills. I can't cook anything. I can't even boil an egg. I can't fix a carburetor. I'm not a mechanic. I'm not a carpenter. I have no skills. The only thing I know how to do is to give speeches and make promises. What would I do? I still think there's a lot of truth to that. However, I know politics, and I could read the tea leaves, and I could see how things happen that are sort of the subtext behind the larger plot. And I recognized that my hopes of going home in the summer of 2018, while they were very real and not unlikely, were going to get slowed up because I started watching what was happening with the Mueller investigation and how the Democrats in the Congress, Schiff and these others, how they were politicizing the Mueller investigation, how Mueller's team, again, some using the same playbook used against me, some of the same people, were doing to Trump what they did to me. And they were criminalizing constitutional practices, and they were talking about Trump's abuse of his pardon power. And that was frightening to me. And to me, that was an indication that I was going to be put on hold. And I understood that. And if I were advising President Trump, I too would have put me on hold, because those Democrats were crazy. They were going to find any excuse to try to bring impeachment articles against him. And so there was no point in him jeopardizing all the big work that he's doing, to help me. You're in that field of business. You're in that walk of work, that line of work. It's kind of like a soldier in a battle. Sometimes, you've got to sacrifice your own self for the larger cause. And so, I was patient and understood that I was going to have to wait, and I would have to wait until the Mueller stuff finally was exposed to be the fake thing that it was. And that took another year or so.
Well, I do want to ask you one quick question before we take a quick break. And the question is, meanwhile, while Mark and Patty, your wife, were working hard behind the scenes lobbying on behalf of your commutation, a truly bipartisan advocacy group was forming, including Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, Senator Dick Durbin, Representatives, as you said, Bobby Rush and Danny Davis, Jan Schakowsky, Eric Holder, Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, all from the left, all come out advocating on behalf of your release. Are you surprised about any specific names that did not advocate for your release?
Well, yeah. Now that's a long list, by the way, and I'm glad you brought up Reverend Jackson. I want to make sure I acknowledge his tremendous help. He was tremendous, Reverend Jackson, and what he did, and Jesse Jr., Congressman Jackson, my old friend in the Congress, what they did. But yeah, it's a long list of people who I thought would be likely to do it and be supportive of it, but they chose not to. And I understood, for example, Tammy Duckworth. Senator Duckworth was given her start through me. I made her the director of Veterans Affairs in Illinois. She had sacrificed a great deal for her country. Her story is heroic, and she was an easy person to put in that position because I think she's a quality person. But Rahm Emanuel introduced the idea to me of her because I didn't know who she was, and I seized it quickly and gave her this big spot, and I think she did a good job. But I thought that she'd be willing to sign some of the letters of support to help me go home, and I was surprised that she didn't. But she didn't hurt me, and that goes to the other side, which is I was also surprised that J.B. Pritzker didn't sign on, because I made J.B. Pritzker the director or the chairman of the Illinois Human Rights Commission when I was first elected governor in 2002. He immediately asked me if I'd appoint him to that, and I was happy to do it. JB had actually supported my opponent, Paul Vallis, in the Democratic primary, given him a lot of money, and he was not a supporter of mine in that race. He had supported me in my congressional race beforehand, but not in that governor's race. But he asked me if I'd appoint him chairman of the Illinois Human Rights Commission, and I didn't hesitate. I did it, and I think he did a good job there. So I was surprised that he wasn't willing to be helpful. But I was shocked that, unlike Tammy Duckworth, JB actually went the extra mile to keep me in prison. Tammy, at least, she just kept quiet, and I understand it's politics. She probably didn't want to, hurt herself. She thought it would be harmful to her political aspirations. I think she wanted to be vice president. I understand that, and I don't. There's no hard feelings towards her, but there are hard feelings toward JB. It's one thing to not support it, and I can understand the business and politics and how. Harry Truman said in Washington, if you want to get a friend, get a dog. He's talking about friends. That's the nature of the business. Some friends are better friends than others, and some friends are fair weather friends. And that's most of the friends you have in politics. So when JB chose not to be helpful, that one wasn't surprising. It was disappointing, but not surprising. But what was shocking and very disappointing was when he called President Trump on a couple of occasions, urging him not to send me home, and going above and beyond the call of duty to keep me home and away from my children. Worse than that, to keep my children from having their father come back home after I'd been in prison for more than 7 years. And so that's, again, my Christian faith requires me to be forgiving. I don't hate JB, but I don't like him. And I think he sucks as a governor. Okay, so I'm sorry.
We are going to take a quick break right now and be right back in a moment with former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich.
Want a little more luck in your life? Get Luckbox, the control freak's guide to life, money, and probability. Named the best new magazine of 2019. Luckbox is a must-read for side hustlers, gamblers, entrepreneurs, and active investors. Each issue features best bets from prediction market experts, as well as timely sports wagering, stocks, options, futures, and cryptocurrency trading ideas. You can buy Luckbox on newsstands, but with this special offer, listeners of The Political Trade can receive a 10-issue digital subscription absolutely free. Just visit getluckbox.com to receive the award-winning magazine right in your inbox. Don't rely on luck. Get Luckbox for free today. Learn more at getluckbox.com.
We're back with former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich. And Governor, I wanted to ask you, when we step back a little bit, you were unique as an Illinois governor because, first of all, you were the first Democrat elected as an Illinois governor in 30 years, and you had a very, very distinctively progressive record. It was a consistent track record on progressive issues, and you had some really solid accomplishments. Soon after taking office, as you mentioned earlier, you helped push through the toughest ethics law in state history. It set up a system of inspectors to sniff out corruption. And you put some limits on the role of lobbyists in state government and restricted the use of government resources for political purposes. You also made major accomplishments in the way of education funding. You rebuilt the Illinois Tollway. You passed anti-discrimination laws for gays and lesbians. You initiated the All Kids program, which made Illinois the first state in the nation to offer affordable, comprehensive health insurance for every child. And you tried unsuccessfully, but you tried to pass universal health care. So you were, by any standard, a very progressive, liberal Democrat governor. Yet upon release from Inglewood Federal Prison on February 18th of 2020, you declared yourself a Trumpocrat. What's changed? How have your core values changed?
Well, one more thing I'd like to add into that list of accomplishments is free public transportation for seniors and for the disabled. Free. That means that'd be something Bernie Sanders would support, right?
That's right.
But I did that, and the only governor, the only state in America who ever did that, all of our seniors. So I just want to throw that in there. A lot of me has not changed, and some of me has in my politics. To begin with, I want to say this about President Trump and about me. I still consider myself a Democrat. Notice I don't call myself a Republican. I call myself a Trumpocrat. I'm a Democrat for Trump. I think I'm the second, how would I say this, high-profile Trumpocrat in America. You know, I think the first high-profile Trumpocrat in America is, Jeff?
Who?
President Trump. I really believe President Trump was a Democrat in the 1990s and perhaps in the 80s. At least, a lot of matters. He contributed to my campaign twice. He gave me a check in 2002 in October at Yankee Stadium when George Steinbrenner, the late great George Steinbrenner, held a fundraiser for me. And then 4 years later, my reelection, he sent a campaign contribution. And I know he supported the Clintons. The fundamental challenge before the American people in our political processes these days is really less about the traditional fight of Democrats versus Republicans. Most of them have been co-opted by the system. Whether if it's in Washington, it's what I call the political industrial complex. It's got it's all the lobbyists and the special interests that surround that beautiful building, the U.S. Capitol, and they represent the big, pharma, and they represent the different interest groups that are in there doing their deals, and that the traditional Republicans and the traditional Democrats, they have differences and conflicts, but they do it within certain parameters. And there isn't a lot of outside the box thinking. There aren't a lot of new creative ideas. And in all too many cases, they've been there for so long in that beltway that they've lost touch with the people back home. And they don't see the world through the prism of what it's like back home in my working class district in Ohio, or in that rural district in Pennsylvania, or in that urban district in San Francisco. Instead, what they do is they see the world through the prism of all the professionals there. The lobbyists, the staffers, the policy people, and the different think tanks, and they've all got their different agendas. And within the boundaries of that, they have their discussions and their disagreements. Then what you have is a guy from the outside like President Trump, who's completely not in that world. And again, a lot of these people have been there for a long, long time. It's no accident, and it's not unusual to have somebody like Joe Biden, who's been there for 47 years? Nancy Pelosi, 40-something years or 33 years. Schumer's been there for 3 decades or more. These people are established Washington insiders, and it's natural that when you're in that world as long as you've been, that you lose increasingly, incrementally, little by little, lose touch with the people back home. You can't associate with them. You don't understand them. You don't even hear them. But you live in that bubble that you're in. And then you get this guy that comes out from nowhere who frankly doesn't need the job. This guy's a billionaire real estate developer who's been successful in everything he touches, in business, in entertainment with his show Celebrity Apprentice, and then in politics. Unlike the rest of us, he doesn't figure I'm going to start in politics and work my way up and run for Congress. I'm going for the top job right off the top. And lo and behold, he beats the most quintessential politician in America, Hillary Clinton. And he does it because he's speaking to most Americans out there. I understand he lost the popular vote. We're going to discuss that. But he's speaking to most Americans out there in the sense that he has a better understanding of what their aspirations are, what their frustrations are, what their hopes are than these professional politicians do, because he's really been among them. And you got to remember, he made his money as a real estate developer. So he worked with contractors, he worked with laborers and carpenters and working people. He knows what it's like to deal with unions and union members. So he has real life experience and real life understanding. And because he's the guy that he is, and because he's in such a strong position, being a successful billionaire who doesn't need the job, and I truly believe he loves America in ways that the professional politicians don't, because they're so busy doing their politics. They don't take a second to realize how lucky they are to live in this great country in spite of all of our flaws. I truly believe he loves America and truly wants to make America better, truly wants to make it great, truly wants the American people to get the best deal they can. And so when I see a guy like that, I see a guy who really is beyond Republican and Democrat. He's somebody who is really populist. And in my view, the politics today is really more about populism against the establishment, we the people against the establishment, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, as opposed to, the traditional lines of Democrats versus Republicans. Let me put it another way. If Mitt Romney were the Republican president, I would not be a Romney-crat. That's not my kind of guy, or I don't really support his kind of politics, nor do I support President Bush's kind of politics or John McCain's kind of politics, those corporate Republicans. That's not the kind of politics I'm supporting. I support this new kind of politics that Trump represents, and he's realigning American politics. He's a transformational figure in many ways. It kind of more straight talking, kind of rougher version of Ronald Reagan, without the soft, soothing way of speaking. He's just the opposite, but they're very similar in that they are speaking to working people, blue-collar workers that have long been abandoned by the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was always supposed to be the party that looked after the little guy and working people. It's become a party of Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and socialism, a strange contradiction, frankly. And it's a party of elitists and think tank policy people who think they're better than the rest of us. And Trump, ironically, understands that and has a better feel for ordinary people and regular people and average Americans. And it's not just working people, factory workers, men and women who used to have good jobs in factories that he's fighting for. He's also fighting for Black lives. And that's, again, one of the great tragedies about how ugly the politics is today. Because it was the Democratic Party in 1994 that pushed through the 1994 crime bill. That's made me a strong advocate for criminal justice reform, because I saw it up close and personal. All these black guys in prison, first-time nonviolent drug offenders, sentenced to 25 years in prison for a first-time nonviolent drug deal, when the white guy gets 5 years. And that's a system that was put in place by Joe Biden, who was the author of that 1994 crime bill. He wrote that bill. And it's led to what the author Michelle Alexander has called the creation of a new Jim Crow in America, because a whole generation of black men have been taken out of the community. They've left their children behind, and they've been put in a place where they're not even given a chance at a second chance because their sentences are so long. And then again, you have in the black communities run by Democrats in Democratic cities and Democratic mayors and Democratic governors who refuse to really do the hard and necessary things to address and solve those problems. And when I was governor and worked hard to try to do something real about it, the opposition I got was from my fellow Democrats, led by Madigan, but a lot of others too, because they don't want to make a real difference in solving the problems of poverty, of inferior schools, of inferior health care, because if they do that, they'll lose the issue, because they get elected on anger and hostility. They get elected on keeping groups of people in places where they're dependent, but not free enough to be able to get ahead and move out and up. And if that happens, they're going to lose a loyal base of voters. And so they cynically, they just talk the game. They dress up half measures as solutions, and then they call the other side, the other guy, a racist when he's actually trying to do real meaningful things. And in the case of President Trump, he's the one through the First Step Act who brought real criminal justice reform by beginning the process of undoing the harsh and cruel sentencing that Joe Biden is responsible for.
Well, you've mentioned a couple things there. Just unpacking some of that. Of course, the new Jim Crow is a reference to Michelle Alexander's 2012 bestseller, which essentially put the entire criminal justice system on trial for exposing racial discrimination and mass incarceration. And your reference to the 1994 crime bill, of which Joe Biden was the principal author, of course, that did come up in the debates.
And Mr. Vice President has said that since the 1970s, every crime bill, major and minor, has had his name on it. And sir, those are your words, not mine. And this is one of those instances where the House was set on fire, and you claimed responsibility for those laws.
Of course, that's Cory Booker back in 2019, mid-2019, during one of the early debates, calling out Joe Biden on his role in basically drafting the 1994 crime bill. And the bill essentially was a result of years of work by Biden, who was the head of the Senate Judiciary Committee at the time. The law imposed tougher prison sentences at the federal level and encouraged states to do the same. It provided funds for states to build more prisons and 100,000 more cops, and backed grant programs that encouraged police officers to carry out more drug-related arrests. It had the 3 strikes provision. And of course, even Kamala Harris made reference to that as well.
That 1994 crime bill, it did contribute to mass incarceration in our country. It encouraged and was the first time that we had a federal 3 strikes law. It funded the building of more prisons in the states.
Well, what's your take on that? What's your thought about hearing the Democrats debate the 1994 crime bill and Joe Biden's role, but now at this point rallying behind him as the Democratic presidential nominee?
Political lip service. And here again, that's what's so disillusioning about the political process. And this is not unique to Democrats. I mean, professional politicians in both parties are good at this. This is what they do for a living. This is what we, the taxpayers, pay a lot of these people. You know, there's good and bad and everything, and there's a lot of good people in politics, of course. I don't mean to say that. And there's a lot of real genuine people on both sides of the political spectrum who generally believe in the things they're fighting for. But I would say more of them than not. They're governed by polls and focus groups and things that test well among voters. They follow the lead of what the focus groups and the pollsters tell them rather than what they believe is the right thing to do. And that 1994 crime bill is a classic case of that. And the great evil that's done from that kind of governing is the results that we see today. A whole generation of black men literally taken out of the community, not being able to be there with their families, having no chance at a second chance, and being consigned to second-class citizen status. Because what Michelle Alexander talks about is, it isn't just what that crime bill did in terms of incarcerating black men, it's what it did even when they get out. Because you can legally discriminate against somebody if he's got a criminal record. So they wear a scarlet letter. It's not S, it's F, felon. So you're a black man and you come out of prison and you've done a long time in prison. But you went there when you were 21 years old and now you're 40 and you're still young. You still got a lot of your life ahead of you. You can still, build a good life for yourself and for your loved ones. But you can't find a job. And the employer doesn't have to hire you. He's not required by law to hire you. And I understand that an employer would be reluctant to hire someone who's a convicted criminal. And I'm not suggesting that we have laws that mandate that they do that. I'm not for that. I do think there should be incentives, and we did that when I was governor, providing tax incentives to employers who take a chance on someone who just got out of the penitentiary. I believe in those things. We did it when I was governor. But the fact is, you can legally discriminate against a person, keep them out of a job, discriminate against them in matters of housing, public housing. The Clinton administration did that. Clinton and Biden, Durbin and Illinois, they did this. Where, in other words, you're a black man and you come out of prison and you got a criminal record, you can't live in public housing anymore. So they basically are saying you can't find a job because of your circumstances. We're not going to let you live here anymore. Well, what's that guy going to do? But go back to what he knows, because there's no other opportunities for him. And so it becomes why she calls it the new Jim Crow, is because the law then allows you to legally discriminate against and segregate black people. It's a more modern version of what they did back in the late 19th century with separate but equal after the Civil War, and of course a softer version of what preceded the Civil War. But they've essentially consigned a whole generation of black people, black men in particular, to those circumstances. And how did it happen? Because you had professional lifetime politicians like Biden. And Biden is particularly dangerous in this sense. I've known Biden a little bit. I had experience with him. I went to Europe with him once on a congressional fact-finding mission during the war in the Balkans in 1999. He's a nice guy, personable guy. Okay, but that's part of the problem. And part of the problem is he's been there since 1972. He was there as a very young man, and he was elected to the United States Senate in a tiny little state like Delaware at the age of 29 or 30, where he was barely constitutionally able to actually be a senator. And so he spent his whole adult life as a United States senator. And that's heady stuff, because they kiss your ass all over Washington when you're just a congressman. Imagine how you get treated when you're a senator. And here you are at the age of 30 and you're that. And everybody treats you that way, and you've been treated that way for 47 years. And your way of thinking is shaped by that experience and all those people in that world. And a part of that world, that political industrial complex, are those professional political consultants and the focus group people. And they're the ones who kind of guide politicians like Biden. He takes that train home to Wilmington. I get that. But he's not spending a lot of time there because he's got to go back to Washington all the time. And I'm sure if you look at his travel records, you'll see spending a lot of his time in other places than in Delaware, raising money in New York and in California and all kinds of other places, not to mention vacations and all kinds of other things over the decades that he's been doing this. But the point I want to make about Biden and politicians like Biden is that it becomes just sort of like second nature. Okay, what do I believe in today? You know what? Let's take a poll. Let's do a focus group, as opposed to going back home and getting the temperature of the real people out there to let them tell you what their concerns are, what their worries are, what their hopes are, and what their aspirations are. So they're driven by focus groups. And back in the mid-1990s, it was all the rage to be crazy about being tough on crime. It was all the rage. It was the beginning of the truth and sentencing stuff that started coming out, where they would make it 85% at the state level on crimes. And for violent crimes, I think that was the right thing to do. But they got so carried away without it being tougher on crime than the Republicans that Democrats like Clinton and Biden decided to go to the next level, Durbin 2, because this is the stuff that will appeal to suburban voters, swing voters, because we already got the black votes. So we can frankly piss on them because they're not going to leave us. Maybe I shouldn't swear like that. Forgive me. But this actually pisses me off because it's so cynical and so wrong, and it's hurt a whole bunch of people, and it's destroyed families, and it's created divisions in our country that shouldn't be there today if this stuff didn't exist. But it was driven by politics. The same reason that Bill Clinton decided that he had to attend the execution of a mentally handicapped man named Ricky Ray Rector, who was convicted of murder. Clinton took time off of his busy schedule as a candidate for president to go back to Arkansas to actually witness this guy's execution, because he said no one's going to, out-tough me on crime. It was that kind of thinking and that mindset that led to the 1994 crime bill. And Biden, I'm sure, had no hesitation whatsoever to follow the lead of the polls and the focus groups and give it no thought what the consequences would be to do such a draconian thing like that. And now, two decades later, a little more than 2 decades later, he finds himself in the position that he's in to try to answer that sort of thing. And the Democrats want to paper over this issue, but I don't think they're going to be able to, because that's real life for a lot of families in the black community. I know this for a fact, having been the governor who spent a lot of time in the black community, frankly, finding comfort there during my troubles, because they've understood that sometimes, the police don't always get it right, and sometimes they lie about you. And so It's very real, very meaningful. And the fact that President Trump was able to do the First Step Act and that it released somebody like Alice Marie Johnson, a classic case of a woman, black woman, who was given a life sentence as a first-time nonviolent drug offender. And after serving 20 years in prison, President Trump sent her home. Those things are very real. And I think President Trump has a lot of support in the black community that you're never going to hear the mainstream media talk about.
Let's talk about that. So the First Step Act, which is it's a clunky acronym. It's a formerly incarcerated reenter society transformed, safely transitioning every person act. Right, the First Step Act was a bipartisan criminal justice bill passed in this Congress and signed by the president in December of 2018, and the results are already pretty impressive. Within the first year of enactment, more than 3,000 federal prisoners were released based on changes to the good time credits calculation, and another 2,000 inmates benefited from sentence reductions from its retroactive application. So this is a major initiative, and you have, on stark contrast, Biden as the author of the 1994 crime bill, which the consensus is led to the mass incarceration of at-risk minority and underprivileged communities. And then you have this major initiative that was led by Jared Kushner and signed by President Trump. Yet our listeners are betters. We bet on political outcomes. And even though I would certainly bet on the political outcome on this coming election that President Trump will have a higher percentage of the black vote than he did 4 years ago. That's a bet I would take. Still, it's only a fractional move. What do you attribute that to? Why is that messaging being lost to the black community?
Well, I don't think it is being lost. I don't know that. I don't know exactly what the Trump campaign has been doing about getting that message out. But if they haven't started doing it, I have great confidence that they're going to do it. I think they're very determined to actually make a real concerted effort to try to win over the black community. And I really believe that's commendable for two reasons. One, it's good politics, but better than that, far better than that, I think it's very important for black lives. If black lives matter, as they do, for black lives to no longer be taken for granted, and that the black community is given choices and an opportunity to take their votes elsewhere. Okay, the black voter in America votes better than 90% of the time for Democratic candidates. When I was elected in 2000 and reelected in 2006, I think I received better than 95% of the black vote. And I'm grateful to that. That's among the reasons why it was important for me to try to send a black senator. And I did with Roland Burris, which is the one I ultimately sent, a guy I ran against for governor. But one of the reasons I was able to do that well is that Republicans, traditional Republicans, don't try to get that vote. And among the ways the Democrats keep the black community dependent upon the Democratic Party is, as I said earlier, they'll dress up measures, half measures, they'll call them solutions, they'll provide some help, certainly government help, federal and state, but just enough to give them something they can have, but not nearly enough to give them a chance to lift themselves up out of the condition that they live in. And I truly believe there's a cynical reason behind that. I truly believe it's by design. When they oppose things like school choice, for example, they're not just kowtowing to the special interests of the teachers union, which is powerful and very important to the Democratic politics, and I'm very aware of that myself. But the fact that they're so close-minded to the idea of school choice, where they would give a young black mom a chance to be able to choose where she may want to send her kids to school. The fact that they oppose opportunity zones that Senator Scott talked about yesterday at the Republican convention, chance to invest money in the black community to develop businesses and opportunities. The fact that they're afraid, I shouldn't say afraid, that they don't want to try new things because they don't want to upset the status quo because they benefit by the status quo. Because why? We Democrats get 90 to 95% of the black vote anytime we run against Republicans. Now, President Trump received 8% of that black vote in 2016. But here's an important point. George W. Bush, and this is shocking to me, he got 16% of the black vote in Ohio in 2004 in his reelection campaign. And George W. Bush's record in terms of empowering black lives and improving black lives is nowhere near the record President Trump has. record unemployment in the black community when the economy was rocking and rolling before the pandemic came. The First Step Act, the act to send Alice Marie Johnson home after a life sentence for a first-time nonviolent drug offender. Other things. That's the president school choice and some of the opportunities that they're talking about. Trump's record in the black community far exceeds George W. Bush's, and yet Bush was able to get 16% of that vote in Ohio. And what matters are the battleground states. So if Bush can get that, Trump should easily be able to double the vote he received, 8% to 16%. And if Trump goes from 8% to, let's say, 12%, there's no way he can lose. Because it isn't just one vote he gets, it's two. Because for every vote a Republican gets in the black community, that's a vote the Democrat doesn't get that Democrat would ordinarily get. So if Trump can move his numbers from 8% to 12%, that's basically not moving him 4 points, it's moving him 8 points. And if he can do in the battleground states what Bush was able to do with an inferior record to Trump when it comes to black lives, from 8 to 16%, Trump's going to win in a landslide. He's going to win those battleground states in a landslide because those are going to be votes out of Philadelphia, out of Pittsburgh, out of Cleveland, out of Miami, out of Detroit, out of Milwaukee. In other words, the big cities and the battleground states. And so do I think he can do it? Absolutely, because he's got a much better case to make. Do I think he will do it? That's for later on in your discussion on calling, what I think the odds are. But let me put it this way. I'm more than cautiously optimistic.
Well, that brings us to the convention last night, the first night of the Republican convention. And it was substantively, I think it was a strong night for the Republicans. They clearly were making an effort to be in front of the black community by their choice of speakers. There was, of course, Tim Scott, Vernon Jones, and Clem Klachik, who's running for a Maryland seat. There's Herschel Walker as well. I think one of the more memorable moments was Vernon Jones when he said,
"Now, when I made the public announcement of my support for President Trump, all hell broke loose. I was threatened, called an embarrassment, and asked to resign by my own party. Unfortunately, that's consistent with the Democratic Party and how they view independent thinking black men and women."
You're certainly not a black man, so I'm not going to ask you how that relates to you in terms of your endorsement of the president. But when you did come out and declare yourself a Trumpocrat, what type of feedback did you get from the Democratic community?
They probably figure, I become a Trumpocrat because President Trump saved my ass and sent me home. And let me point this out. I was a Trumpocrat before he did that. I was sitting in prison as a Trumpocrat. The moment he came down that elevator and I saw him give that speech that he gave and talk about some hard issues, some of which I didn't agree with. And then I saw all the flack that he got and how he was losing business the next day and certain sponsors no longer were going to carry some of his products. And he didn't back down. I knew right then and there this guy was going to win because finally the American people had someone who was real and authentic, who meant what he said and was going to stick to his guns and fight to do the hard things necessary to not only to keep the promises that he's making and to try to solve problems. And he was running against the quintessential politician in Hillary Clinton. And you have to look at our elections over the last couple of decades to really appreciate what's going on in America. And this is why I believe President Trump is going to win again. And he's going to win with cushion and distance, I believe. Because what's really going on in America is they are sick and tired of traditional politics and traditional phony, fake, professional politicians. And with all due respect to Joe Biden, who's a nice guy, he's all those things. And Hillary Clinton, who's frankly not so nice, she's all those things. And Trump sometimes can be not so nice. He's tough, he's outspoken, and he's rough around the edges. He's like that high school football coach, he really expects excellence out of you. He talks tough, but deep down underneath that is that hunger, is a desire to win, to excel, and he has a kind heart. That's how I see Trump as a person. I'll talk about that more later if you'd like. But what I think the American people are, if you look at these last election cycles, what you have is voters who are just sick and tired of politics as usual and the same old baloney, and they see through the BS. That's why in 1992, Ross Perot had a lot of juice for a long time. And the decision in 1992 went to Clinton because Perot took a lot of those voters away from Bush, and those Perot voters have been sitting there kind of disgruntled, wanting somebody else to come in and speak to them. And then Obama runs in 2008, and Obama promises something very different and unique. And here's this guy who can give a great speech, who's personally very appealing, and is talking about and is speaking to the better angels of the natures of the people, to their hopes and their aspirations, by coining phrases like hope and change and hope. He's avoiding substance. It's clever politics. He's staying out of the weeds. He's not really talking about how he's going to solve problems, but he's offering this great hope. And the American people by 2008 were so sick and tired again of the usual politics and nothing real good happening for them that they chose to believe in the better angels of their nature, and they embraced this positive message that came from this guy who was giving great speeches, Barack Obama. And so they elected him overwhelmingly. And then after 8 years of that, they're disappointed because they saw what? This guy was really no different than the rest of them. He just gives a better speech. Nothing's really changed. The middle class continues to get screwed. The factory jobs continue to leave. 50,000 factory jobs left Pennsylvania in the 8 years under the Obama and Biden administration. Since that time, Trump has brought 14,000 of those jobs back to Pennsylvania. But those people are out there, they see that, and so now they're really angry, and they're not going to be swindled again with promises of hope and change. Instead, they're voting their anger and their frustration, hence Trump's success in 2016. This time around, he's speaking to that same group of people, and there's a lot more of them who hadn't voted in 2016 who are going to vote, part of the great silent majority which exists in America today. I truly believe that. And there are a lot of Democrats out there who are voting for Trump, but they don't want to say it because it's politically incorrect, because there's a certain tyranny that's taken place now in the Democratic Party and in the media that Representative Jones is facing, a black man who has the temerity to think for himself. He said it exactly right, because that's exactly how it is, that if you take those positions, you are shunned and you're isolated and you're dismissed as being some person whose motivations are in question. And that kind of tyranny that Democratic Party leaders are putting on Democratic candidates like Vernon Jones, American citizens who are frankly putting their country above their party, is really offensive. Because let's face it, step back for a second. Yes, I've been a Democratic governor, I've been a Democratic congressman, but with all due respect to my fellow Democrats, I love my country more than I do my political party. And I think most people in America are like that too.
Well, you have certainly teased our second episode with you when you come back and speak directly about trading opportunities. We did something that you haven't done before. We walked you into the trading pits where you looked at the predicted markets, and you came away with some insights that we're really looking forward to sharing with our listeners. One of them is an Illinois House race that is pretty much below the radar that, of course, you will have some extraordinary insights to. And I know there's a couple surprise predictions and forecasts as well. So, Governor, you've been so gracious with your time, and we're going to let you go so we can come back for part 2 of this, where we walk you into the trading pits and you actually make some forecasts. Listen to Governor Blagojevich weekly on the Lightning Rod podcast with Mark Vargas, who was also on our last podcast. Governor, Michael and I want to thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Michael. Appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. And that's going to wrap up today's episode. Thank you for tuning into The Political Trade. Tell your friends about us and make sure you subscribe to the show whenever you listen to podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, check out thepoliticaltrade.com to sign up for our newsletter, find us on social media, or send us a message. It's all there at thepoliticaltrade.com. So thanks again for joining us today. This is Jeff Joseph.
And I'm Mike Reddy.
And remember to believe in math, master your trade, and join us next time with former Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich on The Political Trade.